Something people never tell you about Civil War soldiers is that as the soldiers from the US Army fought their way down south to crush the rebellion, they began running into self-emancipating refugees from slavery and liberating the slave labor camps. I think some of y'all call them plantations. And as they did this, the types of letters that they wrote home changed. So near the beginning of the war, you had a lot of your standard wartime letters, right? A lot of "I miss you," "war is evil and senseless," "camp food is boring," "I've got diarrhea," "my best friend died," "I want to make a baby," etc., right? And this is universal in all wars, right? That's what war letters look like. Ask any historian. Well, after these soldiers moved south, they liberated the slave labor camps and they came to understand the condition that human beings had been reduced to under the American chattel slavery system, right? In that system, enslaved people had no legal status as human beings, but as objects. And that meant that the things that those soldiers found haunted them as much as, or more than, some of the bloody battle that they saw out on the fields, right? And we know this because letters home become these radical abolitionist tracts that reflect the very nature of mankind, and that question, what is America and what could America become, right? It's a really wonderful sort of evolution. So I'm going to share with you now a letter from an Irish American racist who fought in the US Army during the Civil War, Captain Thomas C. Fitzgibbon of the 14th Michigan Volunteer Infantry, right? And this guy was writing to his friend Michael Morris, an Irish immigrant in northeastern Pennsylvania. Both were part of the Democratic Party, which you'll remember at the time was the Conservative Party because they did a switcheroo, right? Before the war, he wanted to compromise on the issue of slavery, making it a states' rights issue, right? And he didn't even believe that black men should be recruited into the military, and he didn't want to lead them, right? And this background is important, right? Because it shows us that this guy wasn't someone who was led by his heartstrings, right? He wasn't someone who was already an abolitionist or even a believer in equality amongst the races, right? He was one of those racist Irish dealing with anti-Irish sentiment in America who liked being seen as better than black people. And what he saw in the Civil War changed him. Now, let's read together from his letter, written August 18th, 1862, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, which is just a few hours south of where I live. It was later published in the local paper because of how eloquently it made this anti-slavery argument. So, quoting here, "Our glory hereafter and happiness here hinge upon its total abolition and eradication, and the sooner you of the North understand it, the better for you and your country. When I see and have seen the brother and sister cohabit as strangers, I shudder at the thought that Gomorrah was a place of purity compared with these states here. Such has been and is tolerated. Here you find slaves as fair-skinned and beautiful as their owners. Owning hundreds of these creatures who are subject to base passions and lash, it is no unusual sight to see the master, quote, confiscate, quote, his own base uses, the comeliest and best looking of his flock. The sons of this lecherous autocrat, governed by a like unbridled passion, comes in possession of this species in turn, and a like result follows," right? He's saying gross enslaver, his son does the exact same thing, and therefore on, right? "He too takes the handsomest of these slaves to himself, and being ignorant of the paternity of his servants, right, takes his sister to his embrace, and commits the double crime of using and enslaving his own flesh and blood." Now, what Fitzgibbon is speaking to here is the one-drop rule and the ways in which it promoted enslavers to assault the women that they had enslaved, and then the children of those women were lighter skinned. They were called mulattoes, which is a derogatory word that comes for a black person who has a white parent, right? We don't use that term anymore. And then the enslaver's son would then, in turn, force himself onto those children. So essentially, they're forcing themselves onto their own siblings, which was not legally recognized because, again, an enslaved person at that time was not considered a human being, and therefore didn't have any rights, and certainly was not considered a family member, even though biologically very much related, right? This is what he's talking about. He's saying that slavery promotes this kind of immorality and that it is the most disgusting thing that he's ever encountered. Let's continue because it gets worse, right? And thus it follows from generation to generation. This I have seen in my daily marches and countermarches through Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. In the presence of the husband, the wife has often been dragged by her owner to satiate his bestialities. And yet, neither dare utter a word of reproach or complaint. Think of this, ye fathers and mothers, who view with horror the idea of interfering with the rights of those who set the laws of God and their country at defiance, and whose only aim and ambition is to build up an immense slavocracy designed for the perpetuation of such crimes. This stuff is incendiary, right? He's talking about SA between an enslaver and the people who are enslaved, and the ways in which marriages and relationships between the enslaved are not respected by the enslaver, right? And that the entire South has set up a slavocracy, right? Which is like an entire nation whose political and economic everything relies on this system of enslavement, right? A slave society is what the South was. He's saying, like, are we okay with this? Because in preserving that, we're allowing all of these other crimes against Christianity. He continues, right? This glittering tomb, this cloaca of lust, should not only be cleansed from off the face of our country, but the wide world. Being detached from my regiment last week with 100 picked men to hunt down the guerillas who infest this country as a plague, painful sights frequently presented themselves to me. Here and there, emerging from a ravine or jungle, came the poor, unpitied Negro woman, in almost a state of nudity. In her arms dangled her child, its father having gone with the Yankee to enjoy the freedom God award, but man denied him. There she had lain for days without food or drink, afraid her coming out would bring the bloodhound upon her track. From her panting breast the innocent born of her womb, born to a life of slavery and unknown horrors, drank its sustenance. No one saw or pitied her but him who feedeth the young ravens. This is no fancy sketch written for the amusement or horrification of any party or person. It is the bitter truth, as seen by a soldier who never asked to be excused from duty, who never turned his back on friend or foe. Let the Union be restored tomorrow as it was, and it would be but granting an armistice, not sufficiently long enough to allow us to polish our belts or sheathe our swords. The element of decay and destruction would still remain, and would still be postponing the settlement of a question which should be settled in blood by our children. Let us then, for the sake of posterity, end this question as it should and only can be ended. Abolish slavery. Right? Like what he's saying is that like he's doing these marches to clear the guerrillas out of the rural parts of the South, and he's finding so many refugees from slavery, so many black women who've got like a little baby. They're still clutching the little baby, feeding the little baby, hiding in the ravine, terrified of who's going to find them and who's going to assault them, right? And of course, the father, who is it's implied here is the enslaver, is gone, right? He's like left these enslaved people behind to fend for themselves in a war-torn region. And there was no one there to care for her, right? And he's saying, like, this isn't something that I'm just like making up for you to be horrified by. Like, this is the reality. If we continue to just like allow this to happen, right? If we keep the Union as it was and allow some states to be slave states, then we're just going to have to fight again, right? If we don't fix this problem, if we do not restore the South to some semblance of equality, we're just going to keep facing this problem over and over again. So let us, for the sake of posterity, end this question, right? Abolish slavery. And that was the moderate position coming from a racist, okay?